March 6, 1944. Anzio Beachhead, Italy. A single Sherman tank sits idling in the fog while American infantry screams for help 100 yards ahead. The radio is dead. The orders are clear. Stay put. But Corporal James Halperin, a Pittsburgh mechanic who trusts machines more than men, hears something officers can't hear. A pattern breaking apart. In 60 seconds, he will make a choice that saves lives no record will ever count. This is the story of a decision made in fog, a collision no one ordered, and a man who returned to fix engines as if war had never asked him to break the only rule that mattered. Stay until the end. The Sherman M4A1 had been idling for 43 minutes. Corporal James Halperin knew this not from his wristwatch, which he'd left in his pack that morning, but from the rhythm of the radial engine behind his seat, a Wright R975 Whirlwind that cycled at a particular frequency when the throttle sat just above neutral, the same frequency as the steam turbine governor back at the Homestead Steel Works outside Pittsburgh where he'd spent 6 years before the draft. And when you spent 6 years listening to a turbine, you learned to count time in. Vibrations in the small metal hum that traveled up through your boots and into your spine, and right now that hum told him 43 minutes, maybe 44, which meant 43 minutes since the convoy ahead had stopped moving, 43 minutes since the radio had dissolved into static and partial syllables, 43 minutes since Lieutenant Carver's voice had crackled through the headset with the last coherent order Halperin would receive that day. Hold position, do not advance, repeat, do not advance, and then nothing, just the white noise of a severed frequency and the idling engine and the fog. The fog had come in off the Tyrrhenian Sea just after dawn, dense and low and the color of dirty gauze, the kind of fog that erased distances and turned the beachhead into a series of disconnected islands, each vehicle and foxhole and ammunition dump suspended in its own small envelope of visibility, and Halperin sat in the driver's seat with his hands on the twin levers that controlled the tracks, his fingers resting lightly on the grips the way he used to rest his fingers on the valve. Controls at the factory, waiting for the pressure gauge to climb, waiting for the exact moment when you had to move or the whole system would blow, and he was waiting now, waiting and listening. The Sherman sat in a shallow depression 30 yards back from what the officers called the main supply route, a term that dignified a rutted mud track barely wide enough for 2 trucks to pass, and ahead of them, somewhere in the fog, the convoy had stalled. Halperin had watched it happen from his position. For 2.5 trucks loaded with ammunition crates and fuel drums, 2 jeeps, 1 ambulance marked with a red cross that was already streaked brown with Anzio mud, and ahead of those vehicles, invisible now but present in Halperin's mental map, a platoon of infantry that had been advancing on foot toward the perimeter, toward the German positions that bracketed the beachhead like the jaws of a slow-closing vice. The plan, as Halperin understood it, was simple. The infantry would probe forward, identify weak points in the enemy line, and the convoy would follow with supplies for the units dug in closer to the front. Simple. Except nothing at Anzio was simple, and now the convoy had stopped, and the fog had thickened, and the radio had gone silent, and Halperin could hear something the officers couldn't hear because they weren't sitting inside a metal hull with their ear pressed against the war. He could hear screaming. Not close. Not the sharp immediate screaming of men hit by shrapnel in the next crater over, but distant, muffled, directional, the way sound carried over water or through factory floors when the machines were running and someone 3 rows over had caught their hand in a belt drive and you couldn't see them but you knew from the pitch and the persistence that something had gone wrong and no one was coming to help. Halperin had heard that sound twice in Pittsburgh, once when a conveyor snapped and took a man's leg, once when a steam line ruptured and scalded a crew of 3, and both times he'd moved before thinking, shut the valve, killed the belt, done what the foreman hadn't done because the foremen were consulting clipboards and procedures and by the time procedures caught up men were dead. He'd been written up for it once, moving without authorization, but the man whose leg he'd saved bought him a beer later and said nothing, and Halperin had understood then what he understood now, which was that sometimes the rules protected the wrong thing. The screaming continued. Halperin pressed his eye to the periscope mounted above his seat, a narrow slit of thick glass that gave him a wedge-shaped view of the world outside, and he saw fog, mud, the rear end of the truck convoy barely visible 30 yards ahead, and nothing else. No movement. No infantry. No officers waving signals. The convoy sat like a dead snake, and beyond it the screaming rose and fell and rose again, and Halperin's hands tightened on the control levers. Inside the turret above him, Sergeant Kowalski, the tank commander, was trying the radio again, cycling through frequencies, his voice patient and methodical. Baker 7 to Baker Actual, do you copy? Over. Baker 7 to any station this net. Request instructions. Over. Static. The kind of static that meant the radio was working but no one was answering, or the forward observer was dead, or the command post had pulled back without telling them, or any of 100 small failures that accumulated in war the way rust accumulated on iron, invisible until the whole structure gave. Kowalski tried again. Nothing. He swore softly, a Pittsburgh word Halperin recognized, and climbed down from the turret to crouch next to Halperin's seat. His face close, his breath smelling like the coffee they'd brewed that morning over a can of Sterno. Can't raise anybody, Kowalski said. Could be the fog. Could be the set. Could be they're all dead. He said it without drama, the way a mechanic might say the bearings shot. A statement of fact awaiting decision. Kowalski was regular Army, 3 years in, and he followed the manual the way priests followed liturgy. But even he could hear the screaming now, faint through the hull, and his eyes moved toward the periscope as if he could will it to show him something useful. Orders were hold position, he said. Lieutenant said do not advance. Lieutenant said that 45 minutes ago, Halperin said. He didn't look at Kowalski. He was watching the fog, watching the place where the convoy disappeared, and his mind was doing what it always did when a system began to fail, which was to model the problem mechanically. The infantry had advanced. The convoy had followed. Something ahead had stopped both. The radio had gone dead at the same time, which meant either coordinated equipment failure, unlikely, or something severing the link between rear and front, more likely. German anti-tank guns, probably hull-down positions in the fog, waiting for armor to come forward, and when the Shermans hadn't come the guns had turned on the softer targets, the trucks, the jeeps, maybe the infantry if they'd gotten close enough. Which meant the infantry was pinned, the convoy was stuck, and no one in the rear knew because the radio was dead. Standard problem. The kind of problem that got solved one of two ways: wait for orders that might not come, or move without them and accept the consequences. Halperin had worked in factories long enough to know that machines didn't care about authority. They cared about pressure, temperature, timing, the physical laws that govern metal and motion. You could consult a supervisor while a turbine overpressured, or you could turn the valve, and the turbine didn't give a damn about your rank. It either exploded or it didn't. Men were more complicated, but war, Halperin had learned, made them simpler. Right now, ahead in the fog, men were pinned by something mechanical, something that could be broken if you hit it hard enough with enough mass moving fast enough, and Halperin was sitting in 33 tons of mass with a 500 horsepower engine and orders that were 45 minutes old and possibly obsolete. He looked at Kowalski. "You hear that?" he asked. Kowalski listened. His face went still. "Yeah. That's not our guys yelling for medics," Halperin said. "That's guys pinned down and dying." "Maybe." Kowalski's jaw worked. "Maybe. But we don't know what's up there. Could be a whole line of pack guns. Could be panzers. We go forward blind, we're dead. And the tank's dead. And then nobody gets help. Radio's dead," Halperin said. "Convoys stopped. Infantry's screaming. How long do we wait?" Kowalski didn't answer. The question sat between them like a hot shell casing on a metal floor, something you couldn't touch without burning yourself. The Army had answers for this. You waited for orders, you maintained position, you did not risk armored assets on unsupported advances, you did not break radio discipline, you did not cowboy. The manual was clear. But the manual assumed the radio worked, and it assumed someone in the rear knew what was happening up front, and it assumed time was elastic enough to wait for doctrine to catch up with disaster. Halperin had read the manual. He'd also read wiring diagrams and steam tables and metallurgy specs, and he knew that words on paper had a funny relationship with reality, which was that reality didn't read. "I'm going forward," Halperin said. He said it quietly, not as an argument but as a fact, the way he used to tell the shift boss at Homestead that a bearing was about to seize and the line needed to stop. Kowalski stared at him. "You're not," Kowalski said. "That's not your call. You got a better idea?" "Yeah. We wait. We hold position. We don't get court-martialed for disobeying a direct order." Halperin's hands were still on the levers. He could feel the engine vibration through the grips, steady and patient, the machine ready to move the instant he was. "You ever work a factory?" he asked. Kowalski blinked at the question. "What?" "Factory. Assembly line. Boiler room. Anything." "No." "Why?" Because in a factory, you learn pretty fast that waiting for permission can kill people. You hear something wrong, you see a gauge spike, you move. You don't file a report and wait for a supervisor. You move, you fix it, and you explain later. And if you guess wrong, maybe you get fired. But if you guess right and you didn't move, people die, and you know you could have stopped it. He looked at Kowalski. That sound up ahead? That's the gauge spiking. Kowalski's face was unreadable. He was a sergeant, which meant he'd been trained to enforce orders. But he was also sitting in a steel box with a corporal who just articulated something Kowalski had probably been thinking for the last 10 minutes and didn't want to admit. Finally, Kowalski exhaled through his nose and climbed back up into the turret. "If we do this," he said, "it's on you. I'm logging it as driver initiative without command authorization." "Fine," Halperin said. He was already reaching for the throttle. "And if we get killed," Kowalski added, "I'm gonna be really pissed." Halperin released the brake. The Sherman lurched forward, tracks biting into the mud with a sound like tearing canvas, and the fog swallowed them. The visibility was maybe 30 feet, maybe less, a gray curtain that turned everything beyond it into shadow and suggestion. Halperin drove slowly, using the periscope and his memory of the supply route, the engine growling behind him, and the vibration in his seat changed frequency as they picked up speed. 5 miles an hour, then 8, the tracks chewing through mud and gravel and the occasional embedded stone that rang against the hull like a hammer. The convoy appeared in stages. First the rear truck, then the second, both sitting motionless, their drivers invisible inside the cabs, and Halperin angled the Sherman to the left to pass them, giving them room, and as he cleared the second truck he saw why the convoy had stopped. The lead truck was on fire. Not dramatically, not Hollywood flames, but a low greasy burn that came from ruptured fuel drums, the kind of fire that would eventually consume the vehicle but was taking its time, and next to the truck, sprawled in the mud, 2 men lay motionless. The Jeep ahead of the truck was overturned, its frame crumpled, and the ambulance was slewed sideways across the road, its front tires shredded. Halperin scanned the scene mechanically, no emotion, just data. The angle of the overturned Jeep suggested a blast from the right side of the road. The pattern of shredded tires on the ambulance suggested shrapnel, low trajectory, which meant anti-tank gun or heavy machine gun, hull down position, probably 75 to 100 yards out in the fog. The infantry would have been ahead of the convoy, which meant they'd walked into the kill zone first, which explained the screaming. The gun crew had probably held fire until the infantry was close, then opened up, pinned them, then started working on the vehicles when the convoy came up to help. Textbook ambush. And somewhere out there, the gun was still live. Halperin kept moving. The screaming was louder now, close enough to separate into individual voices, and through the periscope he saw shapes in the mud ahead. Men crouched low, some crawling, and beyond them, maybe 60 yards out, a muzzle flash. The flash was small and brief. Not the sustained fire of a machine gun, but the single sharp report of a Pak-40. The German 75mm anti-tank gun that had killed more Shermans in Italy than Halperin wanted to think about. And as he watched, another flash lit the fog and something screamed past the Sherman's turret. A sound like a bandsaw cutting steel, and Kowalski yelled, contact right," traversing, and the turret began to rotate, gears grinding, the 75mm cannon swinging toward the source of the fire. But Halperin wasn't waiting for the turret. He yanked the right lever back and shoved the left lever forward, throwing the Sherman into a hard pivot, the left track racing, the right track locked, and the tank spun on its axis like a compass needle finding north, 33 tons rotating in place, and when the bow came around to face the muzzle flash, Halperin slammed both levers forward and opened the throttle. The Sherman surged. The engine roared, no longer idling but screaming, the right radial wide open, and the tank accelerated through the mud with a violence that slammed Halperin back into his seat. 8 miles an hour, 10, 12, the periscope showing nothing but fog and a dim shape ahead that might have been a tree or a wall or the gun, and Halperin didn't slow. He'd seen Pak-40s before at the factory, in training films, in the wrecked hulls of Shermans that came back from Salerno. Low profile, long barrel, protected by a gun shield and sandbags, crewed by 3 men who could reload in under 10 seconds if they were good. You couldn't kill a Pak-40 with machine gun fire. You couldn't suppress it with smoke. The only way to kill it was to get close enough that the crew couldn't depress the barrel, and then you crushed it. The textbook said don't charge anti-tank guns. The textbook assumed you had support. Halperin had no support. He had momentum and 33 tons and a machine that didn't care about textbooks. The shape ahead solidified. Not a tree, not a wall. A low earthen berm with a gun shield protruding. The long barrel of the Pak-40 angled toward where the Sherman had been 10 seconds ago, and the crew was traversing, trying to track the tank as it charged. But they were too slow, the gun was too slow, and Halperin could see the loader frozen in mid-motion, a shell in his hands. His face turning toward the Sherman with an expression Halperin would remember for the rest of his life. Not fear but surprise. The mechanical surprise of a system. Encountering an input it wasn't designed for. Then the Sherman hit. The impact was not cinematic. There was no explosion, no fireball, no dramatic music. There was the crunch of metal meeting metal, the shriek of the gun barrel bending, the crack of timber as the gun shield collapsed, and the lurch as the Sherman's bow climbed up over the berm and crushed the breech mechanism beneath 33 tons of moving armor. The engine stalled. The tracks stopped. For a moment there was silence inside the hull. A perfect mechanical silence. And then Kowalski's voice came down from the turret, shaking but controlled. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, did you just ram an anti-tank gun?" Halperin was already restarting the engine. His hands moved automatically. Choke, ignition, throttle, and the right radial coughed and caught and resumed its idling rhythm as if nothing had happened. "Yeah," he said. "Is it dead?" Halperin looked through the periscope. The Pak-40 was a ruin. The barrel was bent at a 45-degree angle. The breech was crushed. The shield was folded like cardboard. And the crew was gone, scattered into the fog. "It's dead," Halperin said. "Okay," Kowalski said. "Okay, we need to back up. We need to get out of here before." "Before what?" Halperin reversed the Sherman, tracks grinding, and backed off the berm. The gun stayed where it was, a broken sculpture of German engineering. "There's nothing else out here. If there was, they would have shot us by now." Kowalski didn't argue. The fog was already thinning, the morning sun starting to burn through, and in the new light Halperin could see the infantry rising from the mud ahead, 10 men, maybe 12, their faces blank with exhaustion and shock. They didn't cheer. They didn't wave. They stood, collected their rifles, and started moving again, back toward the convoy, and one of them, a private with a torn jacket and mud on his face, looked at the Sherman as he passed and nodded once. A tiny gesture that conveyed more than words, and Halperin nodded back. The convoy started moving again 20 minutes later. The burned truck was pushed off the road. The wounded were loaded into the ambulance. And the column resumed its advance toward the perimeter as if the last hour had been a minor administrative delay. No one came to thank Halperin. No one came to debrief him. The radio stayed dead until they reached the rear area, and by the time it crackled back to life, Kowalski had already composed his report in his head. A careful document that would describe the action in the passive voice, equipment malfunction, loss of communication, driver initiative in response to immediate threat, enemy anti-tank position neutralized, no friendly casualties directly attributable to crew action. It was a good report. It was the kind of report that covered everyone and blamed no one and made sure the paperwork stayed clean. Lieutenant Carver found Halperin 2 hours later, after the Sherman had been refueled and rearmed and parked in its designated position in the tank park. Carver was young, maybe 24, with a West Point ring and the kind of face that belonged in a recruiting poster, and he stood in front of Halperin with his hands on his hips and his jaw tight and said, "Corporal, you broke orders." "Yes, sir," Halperin said. He didn't elaborate. He'd learned in the factory that when you broke procedure you didn't apologize and you didn't justify. You stated the fact and waited. You advanced without authorization. You engaged the enemy without support. You risked a tank and a crew on a blind charge. "Yes, sir." Carver's jaw worked. He looked at the Sherman, at the fresh dent in the bow where it had hit the gun, at Kowalski standing nearby trying to look invisible. "Sergeant Kowalski says you heard men screaming." "Yes, sir." "And you decided that justified ignoring a direct order to hold position." "I decided it justified moving forward to assess the situation, sir." The radio was dead. The convoy was stopped. "I assessed." "You assessed." Carver's voice was flat. "And what if there'd been 2 guns? What if there'd been panzers? What if you'd gotten your whole crew killed?" "Then I'd have guessed wrong, sir." Halperin met Carver's eyes. But I didn't. For a long moment Carver said nothing. Then he exhaled and looked away, and when he looked back his face was different, older somehow, and he said quietly, 12 men. The platoon leader says 12 men were pinned by that gun. They would have died if you hadn't moved. He paused. But I can't put that in a report. You understand that? Yes, sir. I can't commend you. I can't even acknowledge that what you did worked, because if I do, every cowboy in the battalion will think he can break orders whenever he feels like it, and then we'll have chaos. Carver's voice was tired. So here's what happens. You get an administrative note in your file. Driver exceeded position hold order. March 6, 1944. No disciplinary action recommended given successful outcome. That's it. No medal. No recognition. You go back to driving, and we never talk about this again. Understood, sir. Halperin felt nothing. He hadn't expected a medal. He'd expected a court-martial, maybe, or at least a week of latrine duty, and the fact that he was getting off with a note in a file no one would ever read felt about right. Carver turned to leave, then stopped. Halperin, where'd you work before the war? Homestead Steel, sir. Pittsburgh. Factory work? Yes, sir. Turbines mostly. Steam systems. Carver nodded slowly, as if something had just made sense. You know what the difference is between a good mechanic and a bad one? Sir. A good mechanic knows when to trust the manual and when to trust his gut. A bad mechanic only knows one. Carver looked at him. You're a good mechanic, Corporal. But don't do it again. No, sir. Carver left. Kowalski came over and stood next to Halperin, both of them looking at the Sherman, and after a while Kowalski said, You think those guys we saved even know it was us? Probably not, Halperin said. You think anyone's gonna remember this? No. Kowalski grunted. Good, he said, because I don't want to explain it to my mother. Halperin almost smiled. He climbed back into the Sherman, into the driver's seat, and sat there in the dimness with his hands on the levers and the engine silent and the smell of burnt grease and cordite still faint in the air. He thought about Pittsburgh, about the factory, about the time he'd shut down a turbine without clearance and saved 3 men from superheated steam, and how the foreman had written him up and the men had bought him a beer, and how neither the write-up nor the beer had mattered as much as the fact that the men had gone home that night. He thought about the Pack-40, about the loader's face, about the infantry rising from the mud. He thought about the choice, about the 45 minutes of idling and listening and the 10 seconds of action, and he realized that the choice hadn't felt like a choice at all. It had felt like a calculation, pressure and timing and the physical certainty that if you didn't move now the system would fail, and men would die, and all the procedures in the world wouldn't bring them back. The war continued. The beachhead at Anzio held, barely, and then broke out, and the Allies pushed north toward Rome, and Halperin drove the Sherman through it all, following orders, holding positions, advancing when told to advance and stopping when told to stop, and the note in his file stayed there, a single sentence that described nothing and explained less. He was never decorated. He was never promoted past corporal. When the war ended and he mustered out at Camp Kilmer in New Jersey, the discharge papers listed his occupation as motor vehicle operator, which wasn't wrong but wasn't right either, and on the train back to Pittsburgh he sat by the window and watched the factories slide past, the smokestacks and rail yards and brick buildings that had built the steel that built the tanks that won the war, and he thought about machines, about how they don't lie, don't hesitate, don't care about rank or politics, or the stories people tell afterward. They just move when you tell them to move and stop when you tell them to stop, and sometimes moving them saves lives. He went back to Homestead Steel. They hired him back without questions, put him on the turbine line, same job he'd left, and he worked there for 37 years, married a girl from Braddock, raised 2 sons, and never talked about the war except once, late at night, when his younger son asked him if he'd ever been scared, and Halperin had said yes every day, but fear wasn't the thing you remembered. What you remembered was the moment you chose to move despite the fear, and whether you'd guessed right. His son asked if he'd guessed right, and Halperin said he thought so. He'd never know for sure, but 12 men had walked away from Anzio who wouldn't have otherwise, and that seemed like a good enough guess. His son asked if he was a hero, and Halperin laughed and said no, heroes got medals, he'd just been a mechanic who understood that machines existed to be used, and sometimes using them meant breaking the rules, and sometimes breaking the rules meant people lived. He retired in 1982. The factory closed in 1986. The Sherman he'd driven was probably scrapped by then, melted down and reformed into rebar or car frames or refrigerators, the metal recycled the way everything gets recycled eventually, and Halperin thought about that sometimes, how the tank that had saved 12 men had been erased from history except for a dent in a bow plate no one photographed and a note in a file no one read, and he decided that was fine. History remembered the big things, the invasions and the generals and the speeches, but wars were won by small things, by corporals who moved when they weren't supposed to and sergeants who didn't stop them and machines that worked when you needed them to work. The big things made good stories. The small things kept people alive. James Halperin died in 1991, age 73, of heart failure, at home, surrounded by family. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was 4 sentences long. Survived by his wife Dorothy, his sons Michael and Robert, worked at Homestead Steel for 37 years, served in World War II. No mention of Anzio. No mention of the Sherman or the Pac 40 or the 12 men or the fog. The obituary didn't say that he'd broken orders, or that he'd made a choice in 60 seconds that validated a lifetime, or that somewhere in a forgotten file in a forgotten archive there was a single sentence that described the day a mechanic decided machines were made to move and men were worth saving. It just said he served. And maybe that was enough. But on March 6, 1944, at the Anzio Beachhead in the fog, Corporal James Halperin had sat in a Sherman M4A1 with his hands on the levers and heard men screaming and made a calculation, and he'd moved, and the machine had moved, and the gun had died, and the men had lived, and no one had written it down in a way that mattered, but it had happened. It had been real. And in the end, the reality of the thing mattered more than the record of it, because reality was the mud and the screaming and the crunch of metal and the infantry rising and walking again, and records were just paper and paper burned. But the men who walked away from Anzio because a corporal broke orders. They went home, they lived lives, they had children who had children, and somewhere in the world right now there are people who exist because James Halperin understood that a machine idling is a machine wasted, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is move when everyone else is waiting. He'd been a mechanic. He'd known how machines worked. And on one morning in Italy, when the fog was thick and the radio was dead and the rules said wait, he'd understood something simpler and older than any rule. That machines exist to serve the living, and that moving them at the right moment, even without permission, even at the risk of everything, is not heroism. It's just what you do when the gauge spikes and the system's failing and you're the only one close enough to turn the valve. You move. You fix it. You explain later. And if you're lucky, someone lives. That's the story. That's what happened. And if you're still here listening, then you understand what most of history doesn't bother to record, which is that wars are full of moments like this, small and unnoticed and absolutely essential, made by people whose names no one remembers and whose choices saved lives no medal ever counted. If this story meant something to you, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell me in the comments. If you'd been in that tank, orders in your ear and screams in the fog, what would you have done? Would you have waited? Or would you have moved?